Hello, I am Austin Caskie. Thank you so much for coming to my talk. This is it's great to be here. Thank you so much to Artifactory for having me. I'm going to be discussing my work with the automatic painting series. It's a body of work I've been developing for a couple of years now, and I'm going to be starting with um, some work that I feel the painting is really in response to. So we'll get into that in just a moment. I do want to just let you know there's going to be a Q&A session after this. So please feel free to reach out with any questions that you have. So diving right in. One moment. That's beeping at me. Okay, so we're going to start here. This is Google Deep Dream. This came out, I think, around 2012, maybe 2013. Don't quote me on that. And this is really kind of the starting point for a lot of things, not just this body of work. This helps jumpstart a bunch of development in the machine learning research area. Machine learning is an aspect of computer science. It's been around since the early 90s, I believe. And it's been kind of dormant, hasn't gotten a whole lot of attention. And actually maybe older than the 90s. It's been around a long time, and it is kind of a different way of approaching problems. And it really hadn't had a lot happening to it until Google Deep Dream kind of came onto the scene. And now there's been a lot of very rapid development in this research area over the last couple of years. It's useful for data interpretation, and it has a lot of applications for like visual processing and computer vision, and so it's a really interesting field of study. Just to make sure that we're all on the same page, I do want to talk a little bit about what machine learning really is. So machine learning is kind of a different approach to a typical computer program. In a typical computer program, you have to kind of explain what to do in every single event case. So if something happens, do this. If something happens, do this. Now the problem becomes it's almost impossible to predict every single event that a computer program is going to encounter. And so that leads to errors and unexpected behaviors, which you can, to some extent, protect yourself from, but it does limit the kinds of problems that computers can solve, because you have to tell it to do every single little thing, and that's a little limiting. Now, you sometimes hear machine learning algorithms talked about as neural nets. It's kind of referencing the fact that they, at least some of them, are modeled after the brain. Our brain is composed of a bunch of neurons, all of which have decision-making power. They can either fire or not fire. And the way that those neurons fire together is how we kind of process thought. And it's a really kind of interesting parallel, because under the hood, these machine learning algorithms create these little nodes that are like neurons, and that they can fire or not fire. And they start to develop these ideas, and certain nodes get activated more than other nodes when receiving certain stimulus, much like in the brain. And that's a really kind of exciting concept. It does create this sort of one-to-one metaphor of like, oh, the computer's just like a brain, or the brain's just like a computer, which I don't think is sufficient to explain phenomena found in either. They're both really interesting ways of understanding each other, though, but they're not equivalent. So anyway, let's talk a little bit about what's actually happening in this really psychedelic image. So if you've ever heard of the pareidolia effect, it's kind of, it's an effect in psychology that describes how we as people can look into a cloud or some wood grain or something like that, And we can recognize patterns that look like faces or animals or objects that we recognize, that we have classified. So when we do that, when we look out and we take our understanding, our object classes that we've defined, like dog or cactus or face, we're really hardwired on faces, and typically we see faces. When we do that and we project that onto something, a pattern in the world, we're kind of using our imagination. We're almost kind of hallucinating it's there. Although hallucinating may sound odd to us, it's kind of a strong word to use in this case. Really, we're just being imaginative. Well, we've essentially got right here, we've got a computer that has learned to recognize underlying patterns and images of dogs, tires, squirrels, fish. And so it's got these object ideas, these objects that it's classified. And then it's looking through this image, and in the patterns that it sees, I believe this is Starry Night, it is superimposing its identifications on it. It's making it visible to us what it imagines it's seeing, which of course looks really strange and alien to us, but it's a computer that's imagining something, and it's really very interesting. And so I just want to kind of hammer home just how fascinating what's actually happening here is. In a typical computer science program, you might have a database of images of dogs. And if you show it a new picture of a dog, if that new picture of a dog is not in the database of dogs, it may not necessarily have an easy time recognizing the new picture of a dog as a dog, unless you tell it to. But what machine learning does is it takes all of that database of dogs and tries to find the underlying structure and breaks it down into different little patterns. If I asked you to unpack your your idea concept of a dog, you'd probably say furry, has a tail, 2 eyes, a nose, long snout, 4 legs. You break it down into component parts that make it easy for you to understand. And in a way, that's what the computer does, is it breaks it down into these little patterns that it recognizes across the spectrum for dogs. And so that's a really fascinating understanding. And then it's taking that understanding and finding it out there in stimulus that is not necessarily a dog. It's allowing itself to dream. So very cool tech. If you want to play with it, it's available. You should just Google Deep Dream. They make it available for you to play with, and you can put your own pictures up there and allow the computer to manipulate them and see things into them that you are not seeing. It's a very cool experience, and it's very fun, cool toy to play with. But yeah, like I said, this jump-started a lot of research in machine learning and the possibilities. There were a lot of breakthroughs. You may have heard of AlphaGo. That's one application of machine learning. It was able to understand kind of abstract concepts that make for good moves in a very open-ended game like Go. And in a way, it's actually allowing people who are at the top of that field or top players in that game to better understand the game they play. And so it's really kind of interesting to see some of the research that's happening. Other things that are happening, they've made it so that, you can kind of you can scale up images on the computer, whereas information would be lost. You can kind of fill it in, it would be super resolution. You can recolor things. You can basically any problem that a normal computer program would have trouble solving, machine learning can actually kind of find novel ways to approach. And I want to show you one kind of important to the art world. example, these portraits right here that I'm showing you, they're made by the French artist collective Obvious. And I'm showing them because they have achieved a certain level of market success, which is obviously not the benchmark for art, but it is one benchmark that we can use to see how artificial intelligence art is being incorporated into the art world. And so this is really kind of an interesting thing. It's using a slightly different program setup than the Google Deep Dream. This is using a CGAN, convolutional generative adversarial network. Convolutional kind of refers to how the program can kind of self-program. It makes alterations to its structure in order to achieve a better result. So it's iterative in that it does the same thing over and over again, and it slowly gets better and learns. It's adversarial in that there's actually two structures underneath that are kind of underlying the build. So there's like there's a critic complex and there's an artist complex. I will talk a little bit about that in just a second. And then it's generative in that it's making something new from nothing, which is a really incredible thing. Whereas Google Deep Dream, you were taking images into, hold on. Apologies, I just had a computer issue. So while the Google Deep Dream requires you to take an image that already exists and to place it into the algorithm for it to give you something on the other side, these are unique in that they actually generate something completely new. So back to that adversarial network, so you can kind of understand what's happening here, because it's really very interesting. The critic can basically get trained to recognize anything you want, like landscape painting, Dutch flower still life. In this case, it was trained on portraits. And so this critic becomes very good at looking at a certain type of painting, a certain type of portrait. And it does that by looking at the underlying patterns within a large database of things like this. So there is still that element of you have to guide it a little bit. It has to be based on something that kind of exists. But it can be as vague as a portrait, which is really interesting because there's this kind of idea of looking at your work in terms of art history that a lot of artists are kind of participate in. And so they kind of learn by looking at other people's work what people expect of them. And what counts as art kind of gets formed around ideas of what you see, and I don't think anybody can really escape that. And it's interesting that there's this art critic complex that kind of has its understanding of art completely formed from this large database of whoever's making the AI wants them to make work like. So that's the discerning critic AI. And then on the other side is the artist AI. Now the artist AI can start with anything. It can start with random noise, like you would see on a TV screen without a signal. It can take that and it'll start by giving that to the critic AI. The critic AI will give it a score. It'll be like, okay, you didn't do very well, and give it back to the artist AI, which will then make changes on its structure. It'll change the image, and it'll kind of keep iterating in that cycle, and slowly something new will happen. And that's how you get these brand new images that they didn't really exist before. If you go through the critics database, you're not going to be able to find any image that looks like one of these, or looks like it was what these derived from. It's new, it's novel, but it's learned kind of the underlying structure of what is expected of it from these portraits in the database. It knows, it has a concept of eyes, nose, mouth, hair, you know. To some extent, it's fuzzy. It actually could probably be allowed to continue to run, and we see maybe some interesting changes. But you know, it does it has a painterly feel. Maybe these don't look like people to us, but they are unique images that were created out of nothing by a computer that doesn't really understand what a human is, but it understands what a portrait of people should look like. It's a really interesting thing. It's kind of something that comes from another world, really. So I do want to say I chose to show the obvious portraits because they've entered the art market. This one sold for some crazy amount of money at auction. It's called Count Bellamy of the family Bellamy or something like that. It's named after a fictional person. This person doesn't exist. It's signed by the computer with its little algorithm at the bottom. Yeah, and there was a pretty large critical response to this work entering the art market. And people are having to kind of make up their opinions about how they feel about non-human made art pretty quickly. Like I said, all of this happened very quickly, relatively speaking. But so yeah, that's kind of some of the stuff I'm reacting to in my automatic painting series. I did go in a slightly different direction when I started making my own work. My work is not necessarily machine learning based, but it is in response to computer generated art. And using a separate field of study, or a separate type of program, I created a bunch of new work, but it really does make an effort to extend that computer as a metaphor for the artist, kind of underlying structure that's showing up in some of these conversations. So I mostly worked with a 3D scanner in making my paintings. So this is actually the program that I use. It's Regard 3D. It's open source, completely free. I do encourage you, if you're interested, to check it out and download it and play around with it. Essentially what this program does is it takes a bunch of photos from different angles of an object, and it creates a sort of virtual sculpture of what it's seeing. You can kind of see here, I really kind of leaned hard on that sculpture aesthetic. By putting it into a white cube gallery, I really kind of was asking people to kind of consider this as sculpture. This is actually from a show at Mount Mercy University, which is not too far over in Cedar Rapids. So I got really excited by this idea that the computer was looking into our world, you know, and working from a flawed understanding, like most artists do. It's attempting to make a replica of what it's seeing in some medium. In this case, it's pixels in a virtual space. But for an artist, it might be clay or some other sculpture material. And so there's this real interesting parallel there where the computer's observing and mimicking. There's that mimicry that's going on. I got really excited by that. And that's how I first started getting into conversation with the machine learning stuff. There's the kind of mimicry of being an artist that's going on with the machine, and kind of exploring questions related to that. So I will admit, I am a painter, and I felt a little bit of a disconnect from these works of digital sculpture. I didn't feel my hand was in them. And that's kind of an interesting sensation coming from me. And you'll see why a little bit later that kind of becomes a driving force in the work. But I started to look at them and dig a little deeper. And going into the files of the 3D models, I started to find this. This is an unwrapped texture. It's essentially a flattened out version of the 3D model you just saw. You can go back and forth there. And it is the computer taking all of the image information that it's going to use on the 3D model, cutting it up and putting it all into one image space. And I thought this was just beautiful. It's kind of jewel-like in a way. I was immediately grabbed by like its aesthetic value. There's a bit of an interesting thing here where, whereas before it was, the metaphor was the computer is looking into our world, observing, and then mimicking in its own medium. Now it's looking into our world, observing, and abstracting in its own medium. It's kind of creating its own image, its own device. And it has some interesting parallels with cubism, in that it is taking images in the round of a subject and trying to compress that all onto a flat surface, and making a design that way that is unique. So there is that interesting art history parallel there, but it's also kind of an interesting parallel to the way abstract artists actually do work. They, you know, are always drawing from observation when they're making their designs. And it's kind of just an interesting thing that's happening here. It feels creative in a way that is similar to some of what's happening with the machine learning stuff, but also unique to this process. And so I became really interested in these pieces, and I thought long and hard about how I would display them. And it kind of comes down to, I've got really two bodies of work under the automatic painting flag. I, you know, like most artists, do my research as I'm making as part of research. And so the first couple paintings in this series are different than the latter half of the paintings in this series. They have a lot more of me in them. So I would paint my partner, myself, our kitchen table, partner again. This one's kind of unique in that it's using a transparent ground. So everywhere that is white is actually transparent. It's just on an acrylic sheet. Kind of an interesting play with materials there. But these were kind of the first attempts at using this process to make work. You can see I'm taking it, I'm stretching it from its square format. I am overlapping multiple, so when it makes a scan of a model, it actually makes 10 or so of the unwrapped textures. Like it makes 10 of these. And I was like taking, you know, the first two, and I was overlapping them to make these like patterns and designs, and really more being interested in the technical term for them is UV islands, which I absolutely love. But these little islands of information, I was pushing them around and making designs with them. And so they deviated a lot from what was actually coming out of the computer. But as I did more research, and you know, and not to separate these because I do absolutely love these paintings. But as I did more research and I kind of solidified what I wanted to talk about with the work, I moved into this body work, which you can see starts to take on it starts to resemble the unwrapped textures much, much more. It's sticking to a square format, it's using the black background, it's using just one of the images, not overlapping anything. And it became much more about process. I stopped wanting to talk about what was the image depicting, and I started to focus more on, it's depicting an unwrapped texture. It's depicting a computer process in which the computer is making all of the creative decisions about a painting. And so by handing that kind of basically the creative parts of painting over to the computer, I was really kind of changing the way I painted and thought about the painting process. I really like this one. But it did become kind of a conversation, an internal dialogue. I began to get a little curious about why I was spending so long painting these pieces. They're very, meticulous. They're very laborious. They took a long time to paint. And I was trying to get as accurate as I could when I was doing it. And I'd handed all the creative decisions to the computer, where I could probably just as easily show the computer's output, and not bother making the paintings, just show the computer's output. And so I had this really kind of unique object. It's handmade, but it's computer generated. And I started to think a lot about what that translation did for the work, which culminated in me kind of extending the virtual gallery idea from earlier with the sculptures. I worked with PS1, that's local here in Iowa City. This was actually the last show in their old space, but I made a model, a scale model of their gallery space, and put it into a video game engine. So it was essentially this little video game. It was a virtual space. You could walk around, and the computer's images were hanging on the wall in an analogous place to where the paintings in the actual gallery were hanging. And you can see, even in the simulation, I have the projection of the virtual gallery in the virtual gallery, kind of creating an infinity mirror. And you could walk around and look at the digital image of the art, stand in the space you were actually standing in virtually, and navigate the gallery and kind of experience simultaneously something handmade, physical, real in front of you, something tactile. And at the same time, you could experience in the exact same context something digital, something virtual, ephemeral, but also the original. And that was kind of a really interesting exploration of the value of the handmade. It was also kind of an interesting experience of like experiencing a space twice simultaneously. Or if you spend a long time looking into this infinity mirror, infinitely. And so that kind of became an interesting little parallel. And it was a cool show. You could walk around with like a little video game controller. It played a lot like a video game in that sense. And it's interesting, and it's something. This is actually something I want to explore more, because during the pandemic, we've actually seen a lot of galleries and museums begin to do similar things with their work. So this is all pre-pandemic. But ever since the pandemic, I've worked actually with PS1 a little bit further, helping them put on shows for artists who had shows planned, but because of COVID restrictions, couldn't safely show their work. So we've actually made a virtual gallery of their new space. And I saw other museums doing this during the pandemic as well, where they put on virtual shows, but instead of just putting it on a website or on an Instagram, the virtual exhibition actually had the context of the museum and gallery space. That's something I want to interrogate a little bit more in the future. I really enjoyed, working with PS1 and making these shows that otherwise wouldn't have been able to happen. But I'm interested in how, in a time when, you know, most paintings get made and immediately put on a website or on Instagram and are primarily consumed that way. You know, you'll have the show in person, but less people experience that. In this world where, like, you know, what does adding the context of like a simulated environment to the experience of viewing the art actually do to the work? Is it kind of the pedestal effect of now it's art? Now you have to consider it a little bit more. And so that's kind of a very interesting thought. I'm also interested to see what kind of spaces, you know, you could show in virtual art exhibitions. Um, you know, obviously the ones I've shown here have all been based on real places. You know, they're measured. They, you know, have the same width as the doorway. All the paintings are to scale. And so you can kind of experience or at least simulate that sense of scale that you get from seeing work in person. That's one thing it does add that's kind of interesting. But yeah, if you are interested at all in what I'm talking about here, you can actually go and download these galleries that I've made. They're all available to download at austincaskie.itch.io. Or you can visit my website, which I'll have a link to later. That has a link to the video game page where you can download these projects. It's great because, you know, some of these shows have been over for a year or two. Some of them have been over for like a couple months, but you can actually go back in a time capsule and still visit the show. But yeah, so that's kind of one form this research kind of took. You know, we are kind of in a weird place where there's just so much out there and so many different ways to interact with media that painting, I think, really should kind of interrogate what it's doing. And I think in a lot of ways it is, but seeing how many institutions jumped on the virtual gallery thing and started using that idea was really kind of interesting and exciting. So to close out, I do kind of want to show some of the other work that I've been doing. This is outside of the automatic painting scope, but you know, it's related in that it's what I'm. It's related in that it's you know, by me. In a way, it's me painting intuitively, whereas this work was very process driven. This other body of work is kind of driven by the unconscious, by dreams a little bit, and in a way, I'm interested in making a connection from work like this and the automatic paintings. There's a bit of an art historical bent where, you know, the surrealist painters, which I think this work is kind of modeled after a little bit, they, you know, kind of treated the brain as like a black box that, you know, they could mine for imagery. The unconscious was some separate other that could be kind of delved into and accessed, you know, through different processes. You know, which all sound like pseudoscience does, you know, and to some extent it is. It's a little bit of magical thinking. But there's already kind of an interesting analogy between brain and computer, which again, I don't think is, you know, an equivalency, but there is an analogy there. And it's not so hard to make the leap that, you know, there's kind of that like internal noise, you know, that's being, that's generating images, you know, and to use that a little bit. And that's kind of a working definition of intuition that I have right now. Again, this work is pretty new. I haven't fully fleshed out how I want to talk about this work, but I did want to share it with you because I think it's pretty exciting work visually, and it's really kind of an example of me. You know, I'm imposing some design frameworks on it, but it is kind of a way for me to chase some of those fleeting images that flicker across, you know, your eyes as you're falling asleep. But yeah, so in a way, that's kind of how this work connects to my previous work. It is nice to let my hair down a little bit and allow myself to kind of just paint. But that is the talk, I believe. You know, you can contact me at this email address. My website is listed below. I'm also on Instagram if you're interested in following my work. A lot of new stuff coming down the pipeline. And yeah, so I think we'll have a Q&A session. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have about anything I've said. And thank you so much for listening.